Hi, ArrrrCamp. My name is David Padilla. You can find me on the internet as David. I work for a company called Crowd Interactive. We are a Ruby on Rails consultancy based in Mexico, more specifically in a small town in the middle of nowhere called Colima. It was a 24-hour trip, but I'm super glad to be here. It's been great so far. Maybe you know who we are as Crowd Interactive, maybe you don't. We also organize the only Ruby conference in Mexico, which is called MagmaConf. It takes place in the paradise city of Manzanillo, and it's not too far from our office. And we're taking proposals, so if you're interested in speaking at the conference, find me later, and I could give you more information about it. But enough of that, back to the actual talk and why we're here. Web applications with Ruby, but not with Rails. First, I want to give you a little history of what I do and how I got where I am right now. I invented MVC on ASP Classic. Well, not really, but a while ago when I started programming, I was actually using ASP. That was like my first weapon of choice. Any of you have worked with ASP in the past, like the classic one? Really, those were the good old days. So I was thinking about those days, and I remember that we had code like this usually on an ASP page, right? Like you open those tags over there, and you connected to the database. You did some queries, and then below you manipulated the information and showed it at some point. And if you wanted to have a different page, you copied all of that into another page, .asp, and then you just changed it, whatever needed to be changed, right? That made me think there must be a better way of doing this. Why are we repeating all this code? What if I need to change something on the layout for all of the pages, and then I have to go one after another, and that's going to suck, right? So I came up with this beautiful piece of engineering. What I did was, OK, so I'm just going to have one page, index.asp, and I'm going to have links all over the place that have a page on the query string. And depending on the page, I will include a file. And that way, I'm not repeating any code. I have the same layout for every page, but only the relevant code will change. Now, this is awful code, I know, but bear with me. Remember, we're talking about the 2000. And back in 2000, being an ASP developer, I thought that PHP was the hottest thing ever, and I wanted to be a PHP developer. Same as Britney Spears was still hot back then, listened to a lot of Nickelback, so come on, different era. Anyway, I moved on after a while, and I began working with Java, Struts, Spring, and all of that. And that's how I began learning about the real MVC pattern, right? And coming from where I was coming, I began to put things together, and I said, oh, this is nice. This is what I was talking about. MVC makes perfect sense. Copying pages around do not make sense, right? So this is basically what I wanted on ASP. I just didn't figure out how, but I tried, at least, I guess. After doing some work for Java, I found Rails. I was fortunate enough to score a job as a Rails programmer. Back then, I was considered a super expert because I could do the classic blog, in 30 minutes. I was hired right then, but it was 5 years ago, so that was all the expertise we all had in Ruby on Rails anyway. So that was great. I found a job, and I've been very happy using Rails. If you are a Java developer that moves to Rails, you know how it just makes you happy, right? It's the same thing, but makes you just happier. And I was happy until I hit what I call my mid-programmer life crisis. Maybe not everyone will hit this. Maybe it's just midlife crisis. I don't know, but I hit something that I would like to call mid-programmer life crisis. And what that means is that I began to think about those old days when I was working with ASP and PHP and all of that, and got nostalgic and thought a bit about my life and what I was doing, and decided that programming web applications with Rails is boring. It's actually boring. Building websites with Rails is not really programming if you compare it to what we used to do back in the old days, right? We used to have all these problems that we needed to solve, and we actually needed to do a lot of code and thinking to solve them, and now we don't because the framework just gives it to you, right? So saying that you're a programmer just because you build your website with Rails is kind of like saying that you're a carpenter just because you bought all your furniture from IKEA, right? It doesn't make sense. And on top of that, we don't know, as Rails programmers, like this is something that we have, we can deny it, is that we don't know what's going on, usually don't know what's going on outside of Rails. An example of this is this recent rant by Konstantin Hasa that says Rails is like the worst rack citizen there is. And when people ask him like what's going on, he goes on ranting and explaining how us Rails programmers never contribute back. For example, someone at that point implemented encrypted sessions for web applications, but they did it at the Rails level instead of doing it at the rack level. So, more frameworks will benefit from that. So, when you do things like that, your code can be shared or used on any other frameworks like Sinatra or Padrino, or maybe just a standalone piece of code, whatever. You need to think outside of Rails. Can't blame them. The problem here is that we are basically spoiled as Rails programmers. We're spoiled. That's the truth. Most of us don't stop and think about what's outside of our little Rails sphere, and I think that's because we get everything delivered on a silver platter. We need to code an application, and there it is. You just need to add a bit of things here and there, and it's running. It's all just there, right? We used to have all these problems that we're not solving anymore, thanks to all these frameworks, right? We used to actually write SQL. Who writes SQL these days? Basically, no one. So what happened to us? We're spoiled. So I decided that I want to bring programming back. This talk is my second attempt at it. I had a first attempt. My first attempt was I invented the Ruby hypertext processor, also known as ArrrrCamp. It's a web framework, and it's a great thing. All you need to have is like a folder that's called CGI, and you add your index.erb files there. And like the one you're looking at right now, you open your tags, and you can add, you can use globals at the top, and you can probably fill that with data from your database, and then just go ahead and display the value on the body. Who needs an asset pipeline when you can set all your style sheets to return from a class method on a style sheets class? And you can build beautiful website just by browsing to the right URL. It's beautiful. I invented ArrrrCamp, but not really, because when I tried to publish the Ruby gem, when I ran my rake release, it turned out that 3 other people shared my vision over these last few years. The only difference with my version is that it's a little bit more modern, and it uses rack, and rack is cool. Sadly, ArrrrCamp, as you can imagine, has not picked up. No one is using it as much as I wanted to. But I did learn a bunch of things when I was writing the framework. And that led me to the example that you will see on this talk. This is my second attempt at bringing programming back. So, enough history. Let's go back to the talk. Web applications with Ruby, but not with Rails, nor Sinatra, nor Padrino, nor anything else. I wanted to show other people, or I wanted to show you what are your options if you want to build a web application, but you don't want to use a framework at all. So let's figure it out. First, the only thing, or the minimum thing that you need to know is about rack. I don't know if you're familiar with rack, if you've heard of it or not, but basically rack is an interface between web servers and web applications. It's sort of a contract or a standard that helps any Ruby web server connect to any Ruby written application. And it goes a little bit like this. The web server will take the HTTP request, turn it into a hash that we will call env, And then it just sends that hash to the application that's supposed to have an object that responds to call. And that call will receive the env hash as its main point of entry. Once the hash goes over there to the web application, it will do its thing, process the request, and then return it in the form of an array of 3 elements. Those 3 elements are the HTTP code as an integer, the headers of the response as a hash, and the body of the response as an object that responds to each. That's all you need. And then the web application's job is to return this array back to the web application so it can in turn show it to the client in the required format, whether it's HTML, JSON, or whatever you're using. For any rack application to work, you need a file that's called config.ru, and that's where you tell rack how your application is going to work. So you need to use the run method, and that run method must receive an object that responds to call, and that can take the hash, and that's it. And since a proc can actually respond to call, then we can do something like this. You can just add this few lines, and you just have the smallest, more useless web app ever to exist. What it's simply doing is it's just going to take whatever the server is sending over to the app. It's going to print it on the screen, and then just return, OK, 200, but no headers and no body whatsoever. If we start our web application using the rackup command, as you start all the rack applications, we will get a default server running. And if you use curl or anything to go to see what's going on, you will see that I'm not getting anything on the body of the response at all, but the headers are being printed on the top, just as my code says. Not a lot to it, but we can see how rack is working. We can see how the information is flowing at least. So we can see all the headers that we got from the server and into the application. So let's do this piece of code do a little bit of something. So first of all, how about we make it return an actual HTML body? Simple thing, cliche, hello world. Just, I recently heard that I don't even need to add the HTML or the body tag on our talk earlier, but we'll add it just for legacy purposes. So the body will be HTML body h1 hello world. Not that we have a body, we're going to need the minimum header, response header, which is the content length. And it's just going to be calculated from whatever the body has using length and turn it into a string, because if it's an integer, rack will yell at us. And finally, we simply return those headers and the body inside of the array, because string does not respond to each. And remember that the last object has to respond to each somehow. So when we start our server, again, using rack up, and then we go and browse it, we can see that it's returning exactly that HTML string that we're expecting, right? Just a simple hello world thing. If you go and browse it with Chrome or Safari or something, you will see an actual page. And this is cool, just with 4 or 5 lines of code. Great. But that's not very useful in general, especially considering that no matter what path you're browsing or what you're using on your URL, you will just get the same content over and over. You know, if you go to the root page, if you go to /post, if you go to /anything, you always get the same content. So in a typical web application or a web framework, use a router or what is called a dispatcher to show different pages depending on the URL or the HTTP method of the request. So basically, its job is just to parse the path and the HTTP method and pass it to the corresponding object and method that's supposed to handle that specific request. That's its job. So let's do something similar in our code. We need it. First, let's do a little refactoring of what we have here, because we need to, since things are getting serious now and we're actually beginning to write something, we need to keep it tidy. So what we're going to do is move this code out of config.ru and put it into separate classes. The first thing that we're going to do is move that core, and we're going to change config.ru to load all the files in my current path, then require the app class that we're about to create, and then just tell Rack that our application point of entry will be an instance of the app class. On app.rb, like I said, we move the call method to the app class, but this is actually not tidy enough, so what we will actually want to do is move that code over to a controller class. So we create a root controller class on the folder controllers, and we add a method show that will return that specific body, because that's what we want to show whenever a client is connected to Slash. So that's a root controller and a root page. So now that this is happening, we probably don't need this anymore, and we just simply call the instance of the root controller that we just created. Just to make sure that things are working, we start our server using rackup, and once we browse to the root page, we basically get what we wanted, the same hello world that we were expecting. That means that our refactoring is working properly. But now, what we're actually fixing right now is creating some sort of router or something that just moves the request among different controllers. So the problem here is that since the request comes through call, no matter what's going on, it's always going to call the show action of the root controller. So we get rid of that, and with all my experience from the past, we add this piece of code, a beautiful case structure like that, like back in the ASP days. And this case structure will simply say that it will parse the request path, and if it finds that it's a simple slash, it will show the root controller. And if it's not the slash, it will show a 404 status because it's not found, and a sweet error page that's just the string not found. Sweet error page. So we start our super server, and when we begin browsing different paths, you can notice now that we get success if we go to the root path, but we get 404 if we go to any other route that the app does not recognize. So if you want to add more controllers or routes, you simply add them to that case sentence that we have there. That is not the optimal way to route, obviously, but it will do for now since we only have one controller. When you do want to add more controllers to your web applications with Ruby, you want to do something more fancy. In the case of Rails, the router is in a gem called Journey, but it's maybe way too fancy. It's so fancy that it's complex, basically, according to the authors. So, routing is a serious problem in general. Don't underestimate it. But, for now, the case sentence works for us right now, so we're going to bear with that. So we go back to our application, and another nice thing to have in all web applications is views, right? We don't want to have all this code around in our controller. That's stupid. Why would we do that? It's not their responsibility. So we're going to use HAML to parse templates and put them on our application. First thing we need to do is require the HAML gem on our config.ru file, so we can use it on all of our code. And then we go and create the actual view. What we want to display, same thing that we had on that string, just the HTML, tag the body, and h1 saying hello world. Back in our controller class, we create a new method, and that method will be called render. What we're going to do here is receive the path to the HAML template that we just created. On the second line, we'll read it as a file, read out all of its content, and then send it over to the HAML engine as an argument of new. And then when we call the render method on that object that results, it will return the HTML that we want to see on our application. Simple as that. So we get rid of this ugly line, and we now call that render method that we just created and pass the path of the template that we just wrote, and that should return the expected HTML. So let's try it out. Once we go and start our server, we browse to the root path, we get the same hello world HTML that we were expecting, except it's now nicely formatted thanks to Haml. Only difference. This is nice. We have views now, we have controllers, we have a router, but there's another thing that we get from typical web applications, and that is layouts. So it means that the action template should only have the relevant code for that specific action, and then somewhere in the application you will have a layout with the rest of the code, and you just use GILF to let the Haml engine where you want to see that specific piece of code. So let's add yet another render method to our controller to read this layout and display it. We will call that method render with layout because that's what it's doing. And we'll also receive the same action view path that the other one is receiving, except that now what we're doing is first, we open the layout as a file, we read its contents, and then pass it over to the Haml engine. But the difference here is that we do render with a block, and then in the middle of the block, we add the rendering of the action. So that way, Haml will take that result and paste it, not paste it, but put it where the yield is in the layout. So instead of calling render on our controller, we just call render with layout. We change the method that we're calling. Same view path because it's going to be passed over. And we start a server, and as you can see, it is still working as expected. It should be working. It is? Yes, it is. Great. Now, if we really want to have multiple controllers, we're going to need to pass all this rendering code to a controller class, right? We need to abstract that. So let's do that right now while we're at it. And the first thing is we require the file that we're about to create, require controller on config.ru, and we just move all that code over and to a separate file. This will be like our super class, and this way we can reuse all this code on our future controllers. Now, for what I think is the last problem that we need to solve when creating a web application like this, in a typical web application, we need to pass data from the controller and then to the view. And at least on Rails, we do that by passing instance variables that you set on the action. And then you just display those instance variables on the views. So let's try and do something similar here on our code. So maybe you noticed by now, maybe you don't, that we haven't referenced env at all on our controller, which is weird because that's where all the info is. So right now, for example, we want to read parameters from the query string, so let's add that reference right now. So we go to our controller class, and we tell it that we're going to need an accessor for env. We force all of our instances of the controller class to receive that env no matter what. And last, we create a params method that just parses that query string and turn it into a hash. And since rack already has a method that does that, we don't actually need to do the code, so we just use whatever rack is giving us, which is it's on the rack utils class. Now, on our super router class, we pass the env that's coming from the call argument into the controller, and that's the way that all controllers are now, or at least the root controller is now going to get access to all those headers where the parameters are. Back to the problem in question, how are we going to add instance variable into Haml processing? Well, Haml it works a little bit like this. Every time you parse a template with Haml, you can pass the context where the parse happens to the render method. So what I'm doing right there is, in this example, is if I'm setting the instance variable available on the view as true, and then setting the binding variable to self, when I pass that binding into render, I will get that instance variable and all instance variable of the current context in the Haml template. That easy. So you can basically pass, if you want to be more careful, you probably want to create a proc that just encapsulates what you want. But right now, we're not being careful, so we're just going to add all the instance variables that are on our controller into Haml. So what we're going to do is, remember that we have these render methods. We're going to add to those methods that they receive a variable called context, an argument, sorry, called context. And by default, it will be self. And that context will be passed all over to Haml, so it can grab it and use it on the templates, right? And we're defaulting to self, because that way we don't need to actually change any code on the implementation. It will simply grab self, and it will work. So the beauty of Ruby. So on our controller, what we're going to do now is just create an instance variable name. It will read from the query string the param called name. If it finds it, it will set it. Else, it will display world, the default that we're currently using. Everything else stays the same. So let's try how that works. So we start our server, and we go straight to the root path, and we were our default hello world message. That's great. That's working as we wanted. Now we pass ArrrrCamp as a name parameter in the query string, and we get hello ArrrrCamp. That's cool. We're now passing over from our query string into our views, and everything's happy. This is basically what Rails does. Now, about your models, you can basically keep doing what you've been doing just by using active record base. I don't know if you know this, but active record is independent enough from Rails that you can just use it outside of it. All you need to do is just create classes. For example, our user model will be something like this. You probably need a config/database.yml file to work properly. You wouldn't get the migrations, but who needs that? But at least this code will work just as expected if you already had your database with your user table, so you can use that. If you're a little bit more hipster, you can use SQL. Has anyone ever used SQL here? Yeah, there you go. Yay, go SQL. You can create class methods that return all the rows. For example, on the users table, you can just access the objects like that, and you begin creating your class methods and just get the data as it comes from the database. That'll be one way of doing it. And if you are a real boss, or a real pirate in this case, you can just use the PG or the MySQL gem directly. Why not? You could create a model like this, then connect to the database, and then just exec a SQL. And this is beautiful because you're actually going to write SQL again. Yes, SQL rocks. The bad thing is that you need to write loops and stuff to put data on instances or hatches or all that. But that's the point of it. You will be programming, and you will be solving actual problems here. But still, only do this if you're like a real pirate. That's it on the code side. I have one last piece of advice for you, which is basically, don't do this ever. Don't do this unless you're some sort of performance freak. When I was done with the talk, I was thinking, well, what's the benefit of all this? So let's see if performance is one of them. So I used AB to run a performance test on my code, and as you can see, it's fast. This Ruby code, the one that you're seeing here, is handling around 700 requests per second, and at a mean of 1.4 milliseconds per request. That's not bad. It's not bad considering that if you compare it to a Rails application that returns the same thing running in production mode, it only works at 400 requests per second and at a mean of 2.4 milliseconds per request. That's like twice as fast, right? But it's obviously not a fair comparison considering that there's still a lot of problems to solve on our Ruby web applications, like logging, caching, pooling, sessions, cookies. And if you're serious about building a web application with nothing but Ruby, we will need to handle all of this. Now, it may sound like a lot, but consider what we've achieved in the last 20 minutes. So who knows? Maybe maybe you can actually, in a couple of weeks, have something that can compete with this. And also, most of these are middlewares, so you can just add them into your rack stack and problem solve. So it can't be that bad. So being more serious, what you actually need to do is read code. Read a lot of code. Read, if you use Rails, take some time to read the Rails code. You take some time to read the rack code, and actually sit down and read the code of all the Ruby gems that you're using. You need to try to understand how things work on the inside, especially the things that you're using every day on your work. First of all, it will make you a better programmer, and you will learn how to contribute to the gem if it's needed. I am very sure that if you read the code of a gem that you're using, you will find something to fix or something to improve. And that's the way open source works, and that's why it works. And so you need to understand how the tools that you're using work, and maybe you should start writing your own framework, you know? You could come up with a faster and better way of doing the things that we are currently doing with Ruby on Rails or with Sinatra or with Padrino or whatever you use. You basically never know. And you will never know unless you actually begin and try it. And in the worst case, you will learn how hard it is to actually do a web applications framework, and you will become more grateful of the Rails core team. So there's a win-win situation over there. Probably the ArrrrCamp team will post these slides somewhere later on, or I will tweet them. I will tweet the link to them. And I will also try and send a link of the code that I'm using for the example with a little bit more things added to it. If you want to start your own thing, it will be great. One last disclaimer, I don't actually think that writing web applications with Rails is boring, nor am I going through a mid-programmer life crisis. That was just a fictitious statement to add drama to this talk. Thank you. That's it.